Yeah. And so I guess um, because obviously we like to have good news in here. Like the thing is like you can actually get to the cool technical work that you want to do. This isn't saying, oh, don't do cool technical work. I think we've been clear enough of that already. Someone would have to be like fairly dedicated to ignoring what we're saying to say that we don't want to do that cool technical work. The challenge is like, well, how can you get to that cool technical work? And essentially doing these more like incremental low tier projects to begin with, essentially what it can allow you to do is parallelize. So just consider a dashboard as opposed to a predictive model. Now you've parallelized the hypothesis generation process. So now instead of you being the only person who generates hypotheses, or you and your manager, it's now a large number of people who are looking at that dashboard, the software engineers, maybe some product managers, or project owners and things like that. And maybe even customers on some level. And so effectively, you now have a range of problems because the hypotheses are being generated in parallel. You now have a range of problems that you're allowed to, from which you can select. And I think that one of the places where a natural place to build off from, for example, visualization, is then you try to deliver basic value at volume. So, and that immediately can become a very data analysis heavy issue. So essentially people can say, oh yeah, this is a cool dashboard and I'm seeing these points that don't quite make sense. Which data points are these? How do I highlight them? Can you tell me which these are in advance? And so it's like, well, boom. Now you've gone from something saying, well, you don't just say, well, just hover your mouse on it. It's impliedly, it'll tell you which data point it is, because obviously that's not quite it. But like bringing, now when people say, oh, this is interesting, can you bring this to my attention? Prospectively, you've now created a new predictive problem. You've had it validated that people need that. So essentially people are saying this is of interest. And so then maybe the next increment is saying, okay, let me try a fairly simple anomaly detection method, et cetera, to start flagging these. Okay. Is that an okay path forward? What are your other options?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, in the case if the product that we're delivering is a dashboard, like you're kind of already hinting at the fact that if that's for internal stakeholders, that's great, because it means that you're going to free up this constant ad hoc reporting function that data science and data adjacent teams will often end up having to do. Because there's a lot of talk amongst teams and companies more broadly about being data enabled or data driven, or using data and evidential kind of reasoning behind making decisions from a business and product perspective. But when you give people the data just without necessarily the context and the explanation around it, that's great, and that's a huge value add, I think, for a lot of scenarios. But it becomes the next stage of the problem is how that the ongoing kind of support and kind of business as usual, I suppose, parsing and understanding of the processes that are being now instrumented properly via dashboard, like how that is done by folks who maybe aren't necessarily data experts, is really challenging. So an example you gave, so someone will be like, what are these? These don't align up with, so for example, let's say it's a particular set of data points on like a time series, and they'll say this doesn't align with what I would expect to see at this time, or there's some other explanation that we need to have given to reason about this part of the data that's being visualized. And you might decide, yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe we should look at some kind of anomaly detection process to either flag these parts or to remove them entirely. And that's certainly one way of trying to approach that problem. But now what you're doing now is like looking at, you're turning like what originally was like I suppose just an instrumentation and kind of dashboarding problem into now is becoming like a proper data product. And how you build that anomaly detection process, which by the way can often be like, not just in dashboarding, will often be like a hugely important part of like a product more broadly. Anomaly detection systems have become central parts of a lot of the products that I've been able to contribute to. That it's not necessarily in some kind of like time series output that it's flagging it. It will be some set of scenarios, for example, that we decide the product that we're developing either has to be aware of or has to avoid, or these cases have to be flagged up from like an instrumentation perspective, not customer facing, but operationally facing, like understanding the dynamic scenarios that software can end up in using anomaly detection is like a really, I wouldn't say it's a repeatable pattern because it's so challenging and domain specific in certain areas, but it's certainly like a repeated kind of value add from data scientists who'll be working as part of like of software systems. On the dashboarding front, you have to make sure that the anomaly detection scenario and the anomaly detection product that you're building on top of the dashboards is going to solve the problem, because if an individual product manager, like a stakeholder in your team from the company more widely, says, I don't understand these points, I mean, those may be anomalies from I suppose, looking at the context that data has been parsed in by a non-stakeholder, but to then spend the effort building a product on top of that to then deal with the individual whim of that one stakeholder, there has to be like a real understanding as to what it is we're trying to achieve by doing that. And if it's a case of, this is just, if there's loads of examples of where, let's say we have a dashboard monitoring some kind of process that's of business like importance to stakeholders outside the data team, shall we say, and we say, there's a lot of noise in here, there's no value add to it, and there's no scenarios that we're interested in presenting this data in, like that would be of any business value. Let's build an anomaly detector and that will improve things. But often those cases that might be of no interest or discardable for one stakeholder could be of interest to others. So it's again trying to get that. I think the answer is it depends on whether that's a useful thing, which is never a useful answer, but it covers things so broadly a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think
sure that there's an understanding as to what you're trying to deliver to add that kind of extra kind of feature on top of just the communication of the data as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key to that, though, is that the best result is to have some type of like NLP model on top of that, such that you monitor all interactions with the stakeholders, and then you have a predictive model that tells whether or not they'll appreciate your anomaly detection method.
So doing sentiment analysis of your coworkers?
Yeah, something like that. Just and I think that's really where people need to be placing their time these days. I mean, if you're worth anything, otherwise, So I think that's helpful. So this is helpful in the sense that if we recognize that the vast majority of people in the data analysis field do appreciate, and I know we'll keep reiterating this, but I like to keep the train of thought, is that we want to do a lot of these fancy and interesting things. The data analysis is typically what we love. And so that means that like sort of on the first step, we tend to go off on this one branch that might say that we'll just turn everything into a research project. However, if you can scale it back, parallelize the hypotheses so that you're not the only person, then essentially you have a large number of things, different projects from which you can choose. And then you can provide incremental value on those. And that those more frequently than not will lead to the same type of interesting problems, but now we're a bit better latched onto one that's probably more important, one that's already more tractable because you've already put in the data exploration phase and things like that. So now let's say, okay, we essentially have these, we now have a predictive model that we want. And it's time people have assessed the value of this. And now it's time to essentially try to start like fusing this into the software solutions, treating this like a software solution. And